And 9/11 dramatically changed our assumptions about what the government is allowed to do. So, and by the way, I should say, the main beneficiary in the United States of those attacks was the CIA. And so there were people at CIA, and I would say John Brennan clearly one of them, who understood that these terrorists, these hijackers, planned to commit violence against Americans in the United States, and they did nothing about it. Now, you can draw your own conclusions about that. In fact, they abetted it. They helped the hijackers get here. Fact.
Welcome back, everyone. In this episode, we'll discuss an interesting conversation between Tucker Carlson and Piers Morgan, discussing the 9/11 tragedy that occurred in the United States in 2001. Interestingly, Tucker Carlson reveals something never published by the mainstream media, especially in the United States, that the 9/11 was closely linked to the CIA. So what happened next? Here's the full story.
What to you, though, Tucker, are the biggest lies perpetrated on the American people from 9/11?
Well, the core lie is the 9/11 Commission itself, which was an instrument, a political instrument of the Bush administration run by a guy called Philip Zelikow. And from beginning to end, he stage managed the explanation for 9/11 in a way that benefited the neoconservative factions within the Bush administration. The point was to leverage the pain and outrage of that day and use it to convince Americans that we ought to invade Iraq, which of course had nothing whatsoever to do with 9/11. And he wrote the commission report with that in mind. And by the way, he wrote it before the investigation took place. He literally sketched it out before they knew what the facts were. And then during the course of the investigation, he systematically, I'm not guessing, by the way, this is not a conspiracy theory. This is the testimony of people who are directly involved in the commission. Chairman Tom Kean, the former governor of New Jersey, Republican governor, he stage managed the entire thing and prevented investigators from looking into like core questions. For example, the CIA was fully aware that many of the hijackers who committed 9/11 were in the United States. They had followed them, as the trailer suggests, around the world. 11 out of the 19 hijackers had visas for travel to the United States issued in Jeddah, Saudi Arabia, at exactly the moment that John Brennan was the station chief for the CIA in Saudi Arabia. They knew that they were here. They didn't hide the fact that they were here. I mean, Khalid al-Mihdhar, who was a 26-year-old Saudi with the plane that hit the Pentagon, was in the San Diego phone book, and he was being followed by the CIA. I mean, this is all documented, and not just by the CIA, by foreign intel services, probably the British, possibly the French, definitely the Israelis. They knew. Now, I'm not alleging that they committed 9/11, but I am stating, because it's a fact, that they were aware the hijackers were in the U.S. and were planning a terror attack against the United States, and they never passed that information to the FBI, to local police, much less to the American public, and 3,000 people died as a result. So what is that? Huge parts of the 9/11 story were left out of the commission report. For example, what happened to Building 7, which was not only not next to the Twin Towers, which were hit by airplanes, but had a building in between itself and those buildings, collapsed that afternoon for reasons that no one has been able to explain since. You're not a lunatic for asking. There's no plausible explanation for how that building collapsed.
Well, so let's talk about that.
That's not even mentioned.
Well, let's talk about that for a moment,
yes.
because it's one of the many things that have raged since. If you look into the investigation into Tower 7, the findings of the investigation into it were that the North Tower, when it came down, had set off a load of fires in Building 7. And it was a steel structure and shouldn't have gone down, but it did. That these fires burned all afternoon, and I think it was about 5 o'clock in the afternoon or something, the tower eventually gave way to the welter of fires raging inside it. And it was the only time that had happened to a structure that was built in that way. However, there has been another tower very similar to that in structure, which has since gone down in Tehran. So it's no longer the only one. In other words, there is another example of a tower like that collapsing. So when it comes to the specific theory about that, what is the alternative explanation? I mean, if you're examining another theory other than the one that the investigation concluded was simply that the North Tower came down, fires were set off in Tower 7, and then it eventually collapsed, what is the other theory which we should give more credence to?
I don't know. I don't know that the onus is on me or anyone who seeks the truth about what happened to come up with an alternative theory. The onus is on federal authorities to explain why, for example, they never investigated it. Why, for example, the rubble and the steel from that building was carted off within hours and sent out of the country to Asia. Why, for example, an analysis done not by kooks, but by chemists found traces of explosive material in the dust from that day. Why structural engineers who have kind of no skin in this game came to the conclusion that that just couldn't happen based on all available evidence. And that none of that is addressed at all or even mentioned in the 9/11 report. So, and there are all kinds of anomalies, as I know that you're fully aware, and there are possible explanations to explain all of them. For example, the BBC report on air saying the building had fallen when it hadn't fallen yet. There are all sorts of reasons to wonder, like, what the hell is this? But it's not incumbent on us to provide explanation. It's incumbent on the people running the government and running the supposed investigation into this to tell us, like, what was that? And
I mean, I have a very open mind. The reason I'm interested to watch your documentary series, I have a genuinely open mind. And actually, I would say it's been more opened generally about this kind of thing since the COVID pandemic. That I was too, I think, credulous about what the authorities were saying through the pandemic to my detriment. You and I have had this conversation. So I'm actually have a very open mind about this. I mean, on the specifics, for example, the BBC report you mentioned was based on a false Reuters report that they retracted soon afterwards and said it shouldn't have gone out. And the building, you could see the building behind the BBC journal. So it was obviously ludicrous. CNN did the same thing. But having been in the news game as you have, on big breaking news stories, fog of war stuff happens. And if it was a genuine error by Reuters, okay. I remember, for example, just as a comparison, I remember being on air at CNN when the hurricane came through, Hurricane Sandy burst through Manhattan. I don't know if you were probably at Fox then, I think. But if you remember, half the lights went out in lower Manhattan. And I remember a report coming from CNN that the stock exchange was underwater. And that had an immediate impact on global markets. And it turned out that was a false report. So these things can happen. Your overview from everything you've unearthed in the documentary, though, have you unearthed any evidence that there was any suggestion anywhere of an inside job? Or is the stuff that you're talking about in relation to CIA and the fascinating details of these two people in particular they were following, is that more cock-up than conspiracy? In other words, was it a gigantic cock-up that after bin Laden had already had one go at the World Trade Center, that there was just not a collective effort by the CIA, by FBI, by other intelligence agencies around the world to stop him succeeding with a second attempt? So is it cock-up, or do you think there is merit to suggestion that some people somewhere must have known more than we've been told?
Well, we know that people did know more than we've been told. I mean, somebody shorted the airlines and a bunch of the banks that were affected. Now, this is not a conspiracy theory. It's not a guess. This is publicly available information. Now, the FBI found out the identity of the person or institution that shorted these events on 9/11 and made a huge amount of money by doing that, but never released that information. So why can't we know who clearly had foreknowledge? I mean, if you're shorting American Airlines a week before 9/11, when no one knows it's coming, I think you should have to explain why you did that. And if you're shorting Barclays and banks that were affected by 9/11, why can't we know who you are? These are public markets, by the way. This is not private equity. This is publicly traded equities. So I wonder about that. So clearly, yes, there was foreknowledge. By the way, there was a team. This is according to the FBI, by the way. This is the FBI saying there was a team of clearly intel-connected foreigners who were arrested after 9/11, as you well know, videotaping the terror attacks. I'm almost verbatim quoting from the FBI assessment of this. And the FBI determined that they apparently had foreknowledge of the attacks. So why can't we know more about that? Exactly. Shut up. That's bigoted. No, this is my country, actually. I know people who died on 9/11. Everything was changed because of it. I promptly went off to the Middle East, just like everyone else in our business. I'm sure you did as well. And then we lost our civil liberties at home. We immediately started torturing people and locking up people for years. They are still locked up in Guantanamo Bay with no charges at all. And the rest of us, very much me included, nodded our heads and are like, yeah, they're bad. They're Muslim terrorists. On the other hand, if your government is allowed to torture people and lock them up indefinitely without charging them, how long before they do that to you? We don't do that here. And I know it's very common in the UK now, which is an authoritarian country. We don't want that here. And 9/11 dramatically changed our assumptions about what the government is allowed to do. So, and by the way, I should say, the main beneficiary in the United States of those attacks was the CIA, which allowed them to happen. So the CIA budget became, more than doubled. Of course, we're not allowed to know what the CIA budget is, even in government. This is a fact, by the way. If you ask a high-level official at the White House currently, what's the CIA's full budget? They can't tell you. It is a secret that is so closely guarded that even people in charge of administering the government don't know what their budget is. But from what we can tell, it's more than twice what it was before 9/11.
Okay, but what you're suggesting with your phraseology about that is that the CIA were part of a kind of inside track knowledge about what may happen, which is obviously an incredibly serious
No, I'm not
charge.
suggesting that. I'm not suggesting that. I'm stating the facts, which are that the CIA was fully aware that many of these hijackers were here, that those visas were issued in a country with which we have very close security service cooperation at a time when John Brennan was running the station there.
But that's different to saying that they knew what was going to happen.
Well, they actually did know that these people were planning a terror attack because they surveilled a meeting planning it in Kuala Lumpur, Malaysia, a year before, and then followed the guy as he came to the United States and arrived in San Diego for flight training. So, again, I'm not guessing about any of this. These are established facts. There's no person, including then CIA Director George Tenet, who would deny this. They'll say, oh, you're a conspiracy theorist. Okay, fine, whatever. Attack my character as you will. But tell me how I'm wrong. And, of course, I'm not wrong. So I'm not alleging or suggesting anything.
I'm not saying you're right or wrong or anything. All I'm saying is that from everything you're saying, it is a leap. It is a leap. There is a demonstrable difference, I would argue, and by all means push back on this, but I would argue that there's a demonstrable leap between knowledge of bad people moving around and maybe monitoring them and aware they may be up to bad things, but actually having coherent, clear knowledge in advance that they were planning the attack using planes on the World Trade Center.
I understand. You're saying that intent matters, and I would not. Of course, I would not dispute that. Intent does matter. It matters under the law, and it matters morally. Did you mean to do it? Yes, that matters. However, it doesn't matter as much as we pretend that it does. If I pull up to a casino and leave my toddler in the back of the car with the windows up and just kind of forget, and the kid dies, do you say, "Oh, you didn't mean to kill your own child"? No, you'd say, "Through your negligence, your child died."
Yes,
it's murder. Now, it's not a first-degree murder, but it's certainly at least a manslaughter.
It's certainly severe negligence. I agree with that.
We know.
I do, and I agree with you.
That is a kind of murder.
Yeah, listen, I don't think there's any doubt that there was massive negligence when it came to 9/11 happening on the watch of whoever was running the US government at the time, the CIA, the FBI, all of them. No one can credibly say that what happened was not a catastrophic failure of intelligence, because I've always assumed there must be some guys at the Pentagon in a room whose only job it is to think the unthinkable. And it's not that difficult to think that one day somebody may hijack a plane and use it as a weapon, right? It's not that. Yes. When you've got fundamentalists prepared to kill themselves as they kill people, doing it using a plane did not seem to me to be that unthinkable. And yet nobody seemed to have thought that through.
Well, the U.S. government had war-gamed that. Of course. Look, I mean, that was, of course, a possibility in the minds of the people whose job it is to protect the United States from it happening. They war-gamed that. They took bin Laden very seriously. We interviewed members of the bin Laden station, CIA bin Laden station, who I think are patriotic, decent people who really wanted to prevent a terror attack. But there are also elements of the CIA which does not act as, a coherent body. It's a vast, sprawling organization. There's not a single person at CIA who understands everything that's happening at CIA at any given time because it's compartmentalized. That's the nature of it. And so but there were people at CIA, and I would say John Brennan clearly one of them, who understood that these terrorists, these hijackers, planned to commit violence against Americans in the United States, and they did nothing about it. Now, you can draw your own conclusions about that. In fact, they abetted it. They helped the hijackers get here. Fact. And so you can argue about why, but the truth is it's incumbent on them to tell us why. We had a fake investigation George W. Bush, Dick Cheney, Condoleezza Rice, Philip Zelikow participated in hiding the truth from the public. Again, I voted for them. It's not a partisan point. That is a fact. We know it now. And why isn't there a 9/11, an actual 9/11 commission dedicated to finding out what happened? And the truth is, not only is there not, but even right now, as we speak, the CIA is effectively refusing to release information that they have from 24 years ago. And why? What is the answer? I don't know, but they should be forced at gunpoint to divulge this. Because
it reminds me,
country.
It reminds me of the JFK files, of the RFK files, of the Martin Luther King files, of the Epstein files.
Well, especially in the case of the Kennedy files, which have been the subject of a bunch of federal laws passed by Congress that demand disclosure. The president, current president, on January 23rd, issued an executive order saying release it all, and they haven't. So why is that? Is it to protect the CIA, actually? Who was the CIA director in 1963? John McCone. How many people know that? How many people care? Nobody. So is it to really protect an agency? 60-odd years later? I don't think it is. Or maybe it is. I don't know. All I know, and this is a statement of fact, that they are not releasing relevant information that pertains to that event. That
I agree with
the murder of a sitting U.S. president.
Yeah.
And by the way, a whole lot of other things. I mean, the UAP, you could just go on forever. And the cumulative effect, it bears on what you said in your smart intro, I think, which is that at a certain point, people understand it's not a democracy, that people do not rule. They actually have no relevant input into how the government operates. It's not operating for their benefit. And they either become one of two things: cynical and resigned, non-participatory, I give up, give me some fentanyl, or they become revolutionary.